I've been involved in a few murder inquiries over the years, but there's one local murder mystery that I came across about 7 years ago that's intrigued me ever since. A murder that took place about 1.5 miles away from where I live. A young lady by the name of Mary Jane Langley. Despite the fact that this is still an open case, all the police files regrettably have been lost. And local historian and author Mike Covell wrote a book on the subject assembled from contemporary newspaper reports. On the 2nd of August 1891, an extraordinary funeral was held at the Eastern Cemetery, Headon Road in Hull. It's said that around 2,000 people attended the funeral. Most of these people were just spectators. Few of them actually knew Mary Jane. The murder of the 18-year-old girl was big news in the area, and most of the people had turned up out of morbid curiosity. The newspapers even reported that arguments broke out as to who was entitled to the best view. And others quite openly and loudly discussed the circumstances under which Mary Jane's body was found and the grisly nature of her death. Several teenage girls acted as pallbearers, Mary Jane's friends, carrying a white coffin decorated with white blooms. The crowd parted to allow them access to the open grave. Mary Jane was reported to be a friendly, pretty, fair-haired 18-year-old girl, a farmer's daughter, murdered in broad daylight within sight of her home on a warm summer's afternoon after visiting Hull to have a photograph taken. The local police bungled the investigation and the killer was never found. There are suggestions that Frederick Bailey DEEMING, who the following year was convicted as a serial killer, may have been the man responsible. A man who has been identified by some as being a prime candidate for Jack the Ripper. Personally, I have my own views on who it may have been, but solving the murder wasn't my aim with this video. I wanted to tell Mary Jane's story, and there was one thing about it that was bothering me. The scene of her murder and the place that her body was discovered had long been lost in the mists of time, and it was a loose end that somehow I felt compelled to tie up. The site known locally as being the place where Mary Jane met her end didn't fit well with the newspaper reports, and it was something that needed straightening out in order to do justice to Mary Jane's story. The whole circumstances surrounding this story are very complicated, and Mike Covell's book covers the story in intricate detail. It is available on Amazon as a very reasonably priced ebook, and I will leave a link in the video description down below. And I'm just going to provide you with the bare bones of the story in order to get around during this investigation, for want of a better word. The humble little bullet seemed like the perfect steed to me. I don't know why, it just seemed appropriate. But the late 1800s were the golden years of steam, and so apart from walking, the local train was Mary Jane's only choice of transport. I don't think Mary Jane was a bad girl, she was a typical teenage girl. And if she set her mind to doing something with or without her parents' permission, she would just go ahead and do it. On the morning of the day that is believed to be Mary Jane's death, she left home without her parents' permission and started a journey into Hull. A home which still stands was situated on Long Lane in Preston, now known as Neat Marsh Lane. As its original name might suggest, this is a long lane that travels from the local village of Preston up towards Marfleet in Hull. The basic footprint of the lane is pretty much the same as it was then, although part of it has now been tarmacked. Something which I think led to the confusion as to the actual scene of the murder. But the rest of Long Lane will probably look much as it did then, an unmetalled dirt track. And this is the route that Mary Jane took on foot to get to Marfleet train station. The Hull to Withensea railway line was closed down in the 1960s, but the building that was once Marfleet train station is still there, now part of a reclamation yard. And this is where Mary Jane boarded the train and made her way into Hull. It's not entirely clear where Mary Jane got off the train, whether it was at Southcote Station or in the main station in the Hull city centre. Commercial photography was still a novelty in those days, and Mary Jane had arranged to have a photograph taken at a photographer's, situated in one of the shop units beneath Aniston's funeral parlour, an appointment that she kept, leaving in time to catch the train back to her home. The Aniston's building is now run by a late-night pharmacy, who interestingly have turned Mary Jane's murder into a bit of a sideline, claiming that Mary Jane's spirit haunts the building. They run regular ghost tours, displaying a photograph that they claim is the photograph of Mary Jane taken on the day of her murder. However, I have learned that the photograph was neither taken on the day of Mary Jane's murder, nor is it even Mary Jane. Contemporary newspaper reports show quite clearly that the apparel that Mary Jane was wearing on the day of her death doesn't match that in the photographs. It's believed that Mary Jane then boarded a train at Southcote Station, now unfortunately gone, and then alighted the train when she once again reached Marfleet Station, last seen by a railway employee walking across the fields towards her home. But Mary Jane didn't go straight home. Instead, she went to Willow's Farm, which has now been demolished, and was situated somewhere behind Somerden House, the largest and wealthiest farm estate in the area. It was a hot day, and a servant at Willow's Farm reported to the police that Mary Jane had called asking for a glass of milk, which she drank, thanked the servant for, and then left. And that was the last time that Mary Jane was seen alive. Now, Mary Jane had made her escape on this little errand while her parents had been away at Beverley Market for the day selling the farm produce, obviously thinking that she would have more than enough time to run the errand and then return home without them being any the wiser. But at about 6 o'clock that evening, when her parents did get home, they discovered that Mary Jane hadn't returned. Now, at first, they weren't too alarmed. It wasn't unknown for Mary Jane to visit friends and relatives in Hull, and at first it was assumed that she had made one of these visits. But as it got later, her father decided to go and look for her. He reports that he walked into Hull and visited several friends and relatives to establish whether they'd seen Mary Jane or whether she was there. And eventually, on coming up empty-handed, he returned home. The following day, Mary still hadn't turned up. It's said that one of Mary's brothers also went into Hull in an attempt to locate her but couldn't. And then in the evening, something which to me is strange happened. Mary Jane's father had purportedly had a dream the evening before that he'd seen a dog sniffing around a holestock on Long Lane. The holestock's situated about 1/4 of a mile away from the family home. A modern interpretation of the word holestock is a bridge, and that is what the murder scene was commonly referred to during the contemporary media report. Now, prompted by this dream, Mary Jane's father apparently went straight to this bridge, and to his dismay discovered the body of his daughter pushed partially underneath the bridge. It was nearing the end of a long hot summer, and the ditch that the bridge covered had apparently dried out, with dense summer vegetation covering both the sides and the bottom of the ditch. And Mary Jane's body had been obscured by this vegetation, which was presumed to account for the fact that although many people had passed that point during that day, no one had noticed her. The local police were called and attended along with a local doctor, Dr. Souter, and Dr. Souter stated that he'd found the body underneath a bridge situated on the right hand side of the road walking from Preston towards Hull, covered by vegetation. When he examined the body, he found that her throat had been cut. Mary Jane was laid on her left hand side with her head resting on her umbrella, and in his words, there was no apparent sign of a struggle in the actual ditch itself. The police deduced that the murder scene was actually just yards away from where Mary was found in the nearby cornfield, with her hat and the flowers that she'd been wearing to have a photograph taken found at that scene. It was discovered that Mary Jane's silver Geneva watch and gold Albert watch chain were both missing, along with her purse. and footprints were discovered at the foot of her body as though someone had made an attempt to push her under the bridge, an action which obviously had only been partially successful. Mary Jane's body was removed from the ditch and taken to the Langleys' home, awaiting a coroner's inquest, which was normal procedure in those days. This incident sparked off a media frenzy, which in some ways hampered the police investigation, but to be honest, I think they would have messed it up anyway. They were under pressure to find a suspect, and they found that suspect in a man called Jack Renard. Now, Jack Renard was, well, sort of a jack of all trades. He was a pugilist, a prize fighter, a ship's carpenter and a general odd job man, whose only crime seems to be that he was in the wrong place at the wrong time. Well, actually, that's not correct. He was known to be in the area on that day, but not necessarily around the time that Mary Jane was murdered. The police, however, weren't too worried about that. They decided that Jack was good for it. They arrested Jack Renard and his dog Ruff and set about wasting time trying to build a case against him. Jack Renard was put on trial at court and subsequently exonerated. Him and his dog Ruff became something of local celebrities, but Mary Jane's killer as a result was never located. Which brings us on to the Jack the Ripper connection. Frederick Bailey DEEMING, born in Ashby-de-la-Zouch in the 1850s, was a merchant seaman, a petty thief, a fraudster and a serial killer. Affectionately known by his friends as Mad Fred in his youth, he ran away from home in his teens and went to sea. But being a seaman wasn't really his career, it was a means to an end. A vehicle, if you like, that allowed him free passage, well, not only free passage, but passage with pay all around the world. It provided him with the anonymity that he needed to slip into a country undetected, perpetrate his crimes of fraud, usually directed at jewellers' shops, and then when his shore leave was over, slip back out of the country and onto his next job. Now, as he learned his trade as a con man, he became a master in the art of disguise. During the commission of his crimes, he would dress up to play the part and assume different identities, using a number of aliases. Now, at the height of his fame, just a few months after Mary Jane's death, it was in fact suggested that he was Jack the Ripper. But his use of aliases and disguise masked this somewhat, and it was mistakenly thought that he was actually in prison at the time, and so was discounted. But more recent research has proved that that actually wasn't the case, and in actual fact, an eyewitness report puts him not only in London during the time of the Jack the Ripper murders, but walking the streets of London on the night of the double murder. It's even struck me that his penchant for wearing disguises may have assisted if he was indeed Jack the Ripper, because several of the victims were seen in the company of men shortly before the murders, but the descriptions of clothing and apparent class status didn't seem to match up. Now, this is where it gets interesting. In 1890, Deeming was arrested and imprisoned for 9 months in Hull Jail, which coincidentally is right next door to the cemetery where Mary Jane is buried. But he'd been arrested and incarcerated under one of his aliases, Harry Lawson. And what is even more interesting is that he was released in July 1891, just days before Mary Jane Langley was murdered. And although I'm not quite sure where the information comes from, it's believed that he spent several weeks in Hull because he had unfinished business with his solicitor. Now, within months of Mary Jane's death, Deeming had murdered his wife and 4 children in Rainhill near Liverpool by cutting the throats and then burying them under the kitchen floor. Now, he sort of had 2 wives and moved to Australia with his other wife, whose throat he also cut and then buried her under the kitchen floor. Now, when Deeming was arrested, it's reported that he had over 20 knives in his possession, a sort of a mobile kill kit. And not only that, he had in his possession a silver Geneva watch, and a gold Albert watch chain. Now, it was sensationalised at the time that Deeming was in fact Jack the Ripper, but that error over him being incarcerated at the time ruled him out. It was established that on his travels he did make a bit of a nuisance of himself with the ladies. He fancied himself as quite a persistent ladies' man, but the ladies didn't see him that way. Deeming was hanged in Australia in 1892. But in more recent years, an FBI-trained profiler did establish that Deeming had all the hallmarks and characteristics that could be applied to Jack the Ripper. So did Deeming murder Mary Jane Langley? Did he spot her on the streets, take a fancy to her and follow her home? The circumstances and the MO certainly fit. It's an intriguing hypothesis that we'll never really know the answer to. Now, what about the murder scene? That bridge? Where did this heinous crime really take place? Now, it's long been thought that this little humpback bridge, not far away from the family home, was the murder scene and the site where Mary Jane's body was found. At first glance, it looks too new, but I can confirm that the actual structure itself is much older and has been externally renovated probably in the 1960s or 1970s. And Mike Covell himself identified it as being the only possible location. In a lot of ways, it does fit in with the description given by Dr. Sauter, but there are also facts that don't fit. One is that the father said the bridge was about a quarter of a mile from the family home. Well, this is less than 100 yards. And then there's the observations by the police that noted the footprints at the foot of Mary Jane's body, and the statement that obviously an attempt had been made to push her underneath the bridge by her feet. Now, I know from experience that trying to push a dead body by the feet is very impractical. The knees and the hips just tend to crumple as you try to do it. Don't ask me how I know that. So you wouldn't use that method to try and reposition a body unless you really had to. And certainly where this bridge is concerned, there is absolutely no reason why you would have to. You would have to stoop only slightly to get access to the arch. There's plenty of headroom, and it would actually be far more practical and easier to just grab the body by the arms or by the shoulders and drag it under the bridge. So I came to the conclusion that this was not the bridge. The murder scene must be somewhere else. Now, I remembered in the past having a conversation with Mike Covell about an illustration made at the time purporting to be the murder scene and the place where Mary Jane's body was found. But Mike said that he couldn't find anything in the landscape that matched up to it. He thought it was a red herring, which actually isn't that far-fetched. Journalists then, as now, were known for just making things up in order to cash in on a media frenzy. And it was assumed that they probably just used an illustration from some other incident. But this illustration had stuck in my head because it made perfect sense looking at the dimensions of the arch, which was perhaps only about 3 feet high, as being a reason for forcing a perpetrator to try and push a body underneath an archway rather than pull it through. Now, it's funny how the human mind works, in that subtle changes in the surface of the landscape can hide a feature that's still there, hidden in plain sight. After my initial filming session, I had to go home. I was expecting a delivery and I had to be home for a certain time. And as I rode down Long Lane, down to the bottom so that I could turn round and come back, this image of this illustration was on my mind. I couldn't shake it off. Now, when you get about 2/3 of the way along Long Lane, it turns to the right, but that's not the original Long Lane. The original Long Lane continued straight up. In fact, in Mary Jane's day, there was no roadway turning off to the right. It was a gated entrance that led into a field, and along the edge of that field it incorporated a footpath known as the Trod. It was an old drover's road, just used occasionally by local farmers. At this point I suddenly had an epiphany. As you can see, the original long lane continues straight up in front of me, the unmetalled dirt track. And where the modern road bends off to the right, the drain is covered over by an almost invisible hole stock. Now, I didn't have a chance to check it out on this occasion while I was filming this. I had to come back the next day, but this is what I discovered. Now, I checked out some facts later on and did establish that this is without a doubt the same 3-foot high hole stock with a double bricked arch that Mary Jane Langley's body was found under. Its identity hidden for decades by the relatively modern road that apparently was laid down over the gated footpath in World War II to facilitate some sort of military installation. The whole stock is almost completely hidden by vegetation, just as it was when Mary Jane Langley's body was found. And I have to say, as silly as it sounds, the day I actually discovered this, it did feel that I was being sort of guided there and that I didn't discover it by accident. Maybe Mary Jane's spirit wanted me to find the answer, so that the true facts about her death could be revealed. Later that day I spoke to a local landowner who's spent the last 20 years researching the history of the geography of this area. It was him who confirmed the location of Willow Farm to me. And he pointed out that the Trod, which was the drover's road, was the most direct route from Willow's Farm, because it went directly past it, down to Neatmarsh Road or Long Lane. So logically, for Mary Jane travelling from Willow Farm back to the Long Lane, that footpath would have been the most logical and direct route for her to get home. It's not quite a quarter of a mile from this hole stock to the Langley home, but having said that, the father would have had to estimate the distance. There was no practical way for him to measure it. I can say without any shadow of a doubt that back in July 1891, the murderer of Mary Jane Langley stood in this very spot while he tried to secrete her body. Whether that murderer was the world's first recorded serial killer, Jack the Ripper or not, is something that's likely to be debated for decades to come. But I have my own theory. If you remember, the father said that he'd had a dream that a dog had been scenting around the hole stock the evening before. And that is what had led him directly there the following evening, resulting in him discovering Mary Jane's body. Now, the 1890s were the age of spiritualism. The notion of life after death was a worldwide craze, so such a statement probably didn't raise too many eyebrows. But then in another statement he'd said that he'd actually seen the dog scenting on the bridge. Two very different stories. Today it's a statistical fact that most murder victims are killed by someone close to them, or at least someone that knows them. And I'm pretty sure that in a modern murder inquiry, Mr. Langley, Mary Jane's father, would have been the number one suspect. He'd left the house to go into Hull on the night of her disappearance. Could it be that Mary Jane had come home at the time she intended to come home, but had then sneaked back out again? Could it be that her father did indeed find her on his search for her when he went into Hull? Perhaps finding her doing something that she shouldn't have been doing. And could it be that on the way home, within sight of home, an argument ensued that resulted in Mr. Langley murdering his own daughter? The answer to those questions, I'm afraid, are never going to be answered. But the fact that he very deliberately and very precisely located Mary Jane's body when apparently no one else could, and at the same time presenting a pretty incredible story for being able to do so, fairly and squarely points the finger of suspicion at him. It is said that the local community thought so as well, and the friction that this caused the Langley family to move away from the farm and out of the area. I did at least manage to solve part of the mystery. The rest, I suppose, will continue to be a mystery. Once again, thank you so much for watching this and my other videos, and in doing so helping to support this channel. I really do appreciate it. I know this video isn't the normal sort of content that I put out, but I did feel that this is a story I wanted to tell. I do hope that you've enjoyed it, and if you have, please subscribe to the channel and leave a like. I will of course be back next week, so until then, ride carefully and I'll see you soon.